under an Obama administration.
Obama made the centerpiece of his campaign the pledge that taxes would not be raised on anyone making under $125,000 a year. He has since gone back on that promise as well and has proposed new taxes on payroll, energy, home mortgage deductions, and scores of other taxes.
He made a pledge. He said, I'm not going to raise taxes on anyone making under $250,000. Is that pledge still active?
We are going to let the process work its way through it.
So it's not.
So it's not.
So it's not.
We're going to let the process work its way through it. All right?
The Senate is looking especially at this issue of capping the deductions for health care that employers and employees now get. That would be an tax increase for many families earning under $250,000, but the president said he was open to it, so that means that the tax pledge he made back in September is no longer operative?
Obama said he was going to abolish the Patriot Act. He now vigorously defends it. We saw the same type of flip-flop when it came to warrantless wiretapping of the American people.
Look what Obama's done with wiretapping, surveillance. He's brought it to heights even beyond what George Bush, the disgusting levels that he brought it to. So we have more surveillance. Now they're talking about, what is it called, Cybercom, the new Pentagon secret cyber society that's going to be watching over us. To get those terrorists, we got to get those terrorists. So now they'll be invading our privacy even more.
So, I mean, it really almost makes you ask the question, would it have been better if we never invented the internet and had to use paper and pencil or whatever?
Now Obama is setting up the Cybersecurity Command, which the government admits completely ends the Fourth Amendment and allows President Obama to shut off the internet in the United States whenever he wishes.
Indeed, in today's world, acts of terror could come not only from a few extremists in suicide vests, but from a few keystrokes on the computer, a weapon of mass disruption. As part of the new single national security staff announced this week, I'm creating a new office here at the White House that will be led by the cybersecurity coordinator.
This new control grid is administered by the Pentagon.
They just want to keep tabs on us. So we're turning into a surveillance, wiretapped government state. The government is taking more and more control over our lives.
I can stand here today as President of the United States and say without exception or equivocation that we do not torture.
Obama made a show of investigating torture, but has ignored the Army's own detailed investigative reports, which name the torturers that the White House memos document were following the directives of Bush and Cheney, the men who are most guilty for issuing the infamous orders.
Some low-level soldiers have been prosecuted for their role at Abu Ghraib, but no senior officer has been held accountable in any of these cases to date. Heidi?
I know that these debates lead directly, in some cases, to a call for fuller accounting, perhaps through an independent commission. Now, I've opposed the creation of such a commission.
Next, Obama expanded Bush's doctrine of indefinite detention of foreigners without trial to holding citizens without evidence indefinitely, without ever even committing a crime.
President Obama today proposed something new, something called prolonged detention. Pre-crime is where people are arrested and incarcerated to prevent crimes that they have not yet committed.
Barack H. Obama, who ran as an anti-war candidate, has continued the war in Iraq, massively expanded the war in Afghanistan, and unleashed a new conflict in Pakistan. Now Obama is promoting the biggest defense budget in history, dwarfing George Bush's war machine.
What George Bush has been trying to do as part of his effort to accumulate more power in the presidency is he's been saying, well, I can basically change what Congress passed by attaching a letter saying, I don't agree with this part or I don't agree with that part. I'm going to choose to interpret it this way or that way. That's not part of his power. But this is part of the whole theory of George Bush, that he can make laws as he's going along. I disagree with that. I taught the Constitution for 10 years. I believe in the Constitution, and I will obey the Constitution of the United States. We're not going to use signing statements as a way of doing an end run around Congress. All right?
Obama guaranteed that once president, he would stop the unconstitutional practice of issuing signing statements, through which the executive branch illegally usurps the legislative power of Congress.
Congressman Kucinich, when he introduced his 60 articles of impeachment against Bush Jr., I think one was the signing statements.
The form of the resolution is as follows. A resolution, articles of impeachment of George Bush, President of the United States. Resolved, that President George W. Bush be impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors. Article 26, announcing the intent to violate laws with signing statements, and in violation of his constitutional duty under Article 2, Section 3 of the Constitution, to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, has used signing statements to claim the right to violate acts of Congress even before he signs those acts into law.
Same analysis would apply to Obama, and a fortiori because he taught constitutional law. He knows better. He's a lawyer licensed to practice law, who, as I am, who took an oath when he was licensed to uphold the Constitution and laws of the United States of America.
With his signature on the spending bill also came Obama's first signing statement, a presidential declaration freeing him from following some of the bill's contents.
I believe in the Constitution and I will obey the Constitution of the United States. We're not going to use signing statements as a way of doing an end run around Congress. All right?
He also promised that he would call on Congress to take at least 5 days to read new legislation before it was voted on.
When there's a bill that ends up on my desk as president, you, the public, will have 5 days to look online and find out what's in it before I sign it, so that you know what your government's doing.
But from his first day in power, he has aggressively pressured Congress to quickly pass bills before lawmakers and the public even have a chance to see them.
Will state his parliamentary inquiry.
Madam Speaker, in order to try to figure out what we're doing, how much damage to the country, I tried to get a copy of the bill. We have out here on the table 2454 that has 1,090 pages in it, but I've understood since debate in here that there's another 300 pages that were added in the middle of the night. My inquiry is, how do I get a copy of the other 300 pages that people on here on the floor hadn't had a chance to read or see? Where do we get that before we cram this down on the American people?
Is there somewhere physically in the House of Representatives a copy of what we're voting on?
The gentleman has not stated a parliamentary inquiry that the chair can answer.
Mr. Speaker, I have to say that I am outraged. Here we are getting ready to vote on a piece of legislation, and we haven't even seen 300 pieces of this legislation. No one can even find the bill or even knows where it's at.
Obama swore that he would never put lobbyists or donors in his administration.
Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner appointed Mark Patterson, and this is a former top lobbyist for Goldman Sachs, as his chief of staff. And then last week there was a lot of buzz over William Lynn. He was appointed to the #2 position at the Defense Department. William Lynn, also a former top lobbyist for Raytheon, which is one of the 5 largest defense contractors.
He has now broken all previous records by cramming his administration full of contributors and lobbyists who openly write legislation being proposed by the White House. There's a good reason Obama doesn't want to give the people or Congress any time to read the bills.
I'm still needing a copy of the other 300 mysterious pages that we don't get to see here.
Shortly after the 2008 election, Vice President Joe Biden confided to top supporters that it was essential that their program be implemented at lightning speed. Because their agenda was so unpopular, they knew Obama would lose support quickly. Obama's handlers were in a race to pass a raft of legislation before the people discovered that Obama was just a slicker, updated version of previous puppets. Obama is the New World Order's closer. It's his job to repackage and solidify the tyrannical policies of George W. Bush as progressive and trendy.
So part of my job, I think, as president, is to make government cool again.
Chris Hedges, author of Empire of Illusion, explained it succinctly. President Obama does one thing, and brand Obama gets you to believe another. This is the essence of successful advertising. You buy or do what the advertiser wants because of how they make you feel. Through Obama, the global establishment are now putting their entire program into high gear. Obama is attempting to dismantle the Second Amendment with more than a dozen victim disarmament bills now in Congress.
The key is going to be, I think, for us to come together and say people do have an individual right, and there's nothing wrong with common sense gun laws.
Hate crime and cyberbullying bills in the House and Senate would effectively criminalize free speech protected under the First Amendment.
It is absolutely true that NAFTA was a mistake.
A senior member of the Obama campaign called the Canadian government within the last month to say that when Senator Obama talks about opting out of the free trade deal, the Canadian government shouldn't worry. The operative said it's just campaign rhetoric and don't take it seriously.
Campaign officials called the U.S. ambassador to Canada and say, don't worry, it's just campaign rhetoric about NAFTA.
The Canadian government put out a statement indicating that this was just not true. So I don't know who the sources. It wasn't true.
Amid all of the denials, sources at the highest level of the Canadian government who first confirmed that a call was made, late this afternoon reconfirmed that a call was made.
President Obama is promoting the creation of a North American Union and is attempting to expand NAFTA and GATT. President Obama is pushing nation-ending blanket amnesty for more than 20 million foreign aliens living illegally inside the United States. He's also overseeing the hijacking of health care by the federal government, which will nationalize more than 20% of the U.S. economy.
And you want us to believe that a government that can't even run a cash for clunkers program is going to run 1/7 of our U.S. economy. No, sir. No.
Obama is continuing the transfer of national sovereignty to unelected international bodies like the United Nations and World Trade Organization. And most important of all, under the cover of banking reform, Obama wants to hand dictatorial power over the United States economy to an offshore private banking cartel known as the Bank of the World.
Richard, what happened to all those threats from France's president about storming out and about having a global regulator who was going to reach across borders and be able to deal with markets no matter what country they were in?
They have opened up the idea of there being some form of other regulator across countries, and I think that's going to come back.
So is this some sort of new world order, which Gordon Brown kind of alluded to?
I think a new world order is emerging, and with it the foundations of a new and progressive era of international cooperation.
The finance heads of the 20 industrialized nations met again in late September of 2009 at the G20 summit in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. At that meeting, ministers called for an end to the dollar as the world reserve currency. They also called for a strengthening of global governance and called for a new world order. While the bankers were busy carving up the world at the G20 summit, Barack Obama was in New York City at the United Nations because he's got a new job to chair the United Nations Security Council, the most powerful position in the world government body.
President Obama does what no other U.S. president ever has. As President Obama presided over the UN's most powerful body, that would be the Security Council.
6,191st meeting of the Security Council.
For a couple of hours, you could say Mr. Obama was president of the world.
It is the story of a world that understands that no difference or division is worth destroying all that we have built. In my own country, it has brought Democrats and Republican leaders together. Leaders like George Shultz, Bill Perry, Henry Kissinger, and Sam Nunn, who are with us here today.
Barack Obama is the first president to hold two posts simultaneously. And there's a good reason for that. It's illegal. Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution forbids any U.S. president from serving any foreign government or institution. He swears an oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. But now Barack Obama has sworn allegiance to the global government and the United Nations that he heads up. Let that sink in real good. Barack Obama now heads the United Nations Security Council. You cannot serve two masters, and Obama isn't. He's selling out the last vestiges of sovereignty that this country had. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the destruction of our nation, and it's also high treason. Obama's lies are obvious and out in the open. He hides in plain sight. And from the moment he took office, his lies have only increased. Despite the fact that his ratings have dramatically dropped since Election Day, from the mid-80s to the low 40s, a large portion of Americans still gullibly hang on his every word.
It is bringing entertainment to thousands of people. Through its magic, we are able to enjoy a combination of the radio, motion pictures, and the stage, right in the comfort of our own homes, simply by pushing a button and turning a dial. These cells with their electrical charges are scanned by a stream of electrons, completing 30 pictures a second. Compare that crude picture with these of today, and you can judge for yourself how far along the road to perfection television has traveled.
Most people still today think that all entertainment to do with movies, drama, is therefore nothing more than their entertainment. It never ever was that case.
Of course, television can't perform such miracles as this, yet. But perhaps there's no harm wishing that it could.
The greatest social messages are promoted through movies and drama, high drama, through the fixation of emotive sequences, emotional sequences, not logical, factual sequences, but pushing points across in an emotional way which register and fix in the mind. So emotional content is very, very important, rather than going through an actual discussion or an argument using logic and facts. There's no debate. And when you're being downloaded through fiction, your guard is down, the censor part of your brain is not in action. It isn't saying, yes, I agree with this, I disagree with that, as you would in a debate or a lecture. You're actually in an alpha state, being completely downloaded with new ideas.
Throughout history, social engineers have refined techniques designed to control large populations.
About 100 years ago, this big organization with many branches, they wanted to rule the world basically using Britain as a nucleus of a system, an embryo, which also was going to be joined with the US under the Anglo-American establishment, wrote about the kind of culture and the changes of culture over a 100-year period that they would actually design, implement, and bring in. And H.G. Wells talked about it too. He talked about arenas. He says arenas could be put up across the world for sports, for instance. Now at that time, sports was something that children, school children were into. Adults became adults and got onto adult things. So it was unimaginable at the time that people could actually believe that there was even a need for adult sports and entertainment, never mind having arenas built across the world. But he said we can do this, and foist basically a sports culture for the males. Using a tribal system, we're all tribal to an extent. That's why we even bother to vote for a tribal leader. This is well understood. That's why we're supplied with these leaders. And because the average man was to become more disengaged from his own destiny as the expert class arose, it was decided that the males would get their outlet basically, gradually becoming helpless as males through sports. Therefore they'd have a tribal team they could identify with, they could cheer them on as they were winning. In their own personal lives they were getting nowhere, they were getting disenfranchised in a sense as experts took over decision making for them in all kinds of fields. So this was psychology at use, planned before they even implemented the sports. When radio came along, of course, they used that to the maximum. sports for the men, soaps basically for the women, and then in came television, as I say, with its alpha state, its hypnotic state, and sure enough, around the 1960s, really, 50s and 60s, it took off. It really, really took off. And men became glued on Saturday nights to the sports shows. A culture industry, which is called by its own the culture industry. The Soviet Union had a department called the culture industry. Their actors and directors were called the cultural leaders, because they would, like a computer, people are like computers, all you have to do is keep giving them new updates every so often, and you can change an entire country or a nation or a block of nations who are all getting the same upgrades at the same time along certain paths. Today we call it political correctness. Most people want to belong to their peer group. They want to be the same as everyone else when it comes to opinions. In fact, they judge their own personal sanity by bouncing ideas off their neighbors and friends who will answer back and agree on these same topics in kind. It doesn't matter if the topics or what you're given are facts or utter nonsense, as long as everyone agrees at the same time. You'll say, well, I'm sane, and your friends will all agree because they've had the same information given to them.
But they've been programmed, and I'm sad because I know that it's hard for people like that to take an interest, a serious interest in world affairs, to take a serious interest in what their elected officials are doing. And they're not going to be really inclined to study or discover the deception that's being used against them. And so I'm sad because I see all of that in a flash in my mind as being an indication of how easy it is for the masses to be manipulated.
The scientific dictatorship understands what makes human beings tick. They understand our psychology. They've studied it, and they're using it against us. But the minute the public awakens to the fact that there is an agenda to manipulate them, and the second the public realizes that they are being conditioned and controlled, the establishment begins to lose that edge they've got over people. So all I ask viewers to do is to think for themselves and to study public relations, to study advertising, to study propaganda, and to realize how much of it is out there in their daily lives. And then make the decision for yourself. I just want people to think on their own and to not have their decisions and their thoughts and their ideas pre-packaged and basically downloaded into them.
If it's on TV and a famous face says something, then it must be true. He doesn't have to show you facts or anything else. You've been brought up with these faces. That's why they keep these guys on television into their 70s and 80s. You've grown up with this father figure who's on television every night at 6 o'clock, in your house, in your room, staring right at you, and he's a father figure. Would he tell you a lie? So you naturally never suspect him. And this same man will lead you through new topics. He'll introduce experts on the topics. They'll have a little summary at the end of every talk, and you are now left with the conclusion that's presented to you. You don't arrive at it, it's given to you, and it's good enough for you.
When I was growing up, people were talking on their front porches, neighbors were playing baseball, there were nightly barbecues. You don't see that anymore. We've lost our communities. You drive through neighborhoods, you see the blue glow of television sets. We're losing our humanity. So if you want to rebel against the globalists, the social engineers, start by turning the TV off a few hours a day and actually getting to know your neighbors. Getting outside that comfort zone, expanding your horizons. By coming together as communities, by getting to know our neighbors, we defeat the social engineers.
We're programmed today perfectly, just like machines. We tie this in with the Brzezinski. Brzezinski said in 2 Ages. Now this guy was way up with the NSA. He's a master geopolitician. He admits he works in 20, 50-year periods to do with geopolitics in other countries. But he said himself, the public will shortly be unable to think or reason for themselves. It was meaning by the form of information that was given to them, the type, the formulas that were in use then in the 1970s. He says eventually they'll be unable to think or reason for themselves. And eventually, he said, they will expect the media to do all their thinking and reasoning for them. Well, that's happened today. That's why people today can't think outside of the programming from television.
Zbigniew Brzezinski, Obama's main foreign policy advisor, talks about how a cult of personality can be artificially manufactured to influence the masses.
In the first months of my administration, to pull our economy... Oh, goodness. Sorry about that, guys. To pull our economy back from the brink, including the largest and most sweeping economic recovery plan in our nation's history.
We're gullible, but we're also willingly gullible. We want a human being, a big daddy, to come along and make everything right for us. And as long as we believe that, we'll always basically get shafted.
In addition to John, sorry, I just noticed that I jumped the gun here. Go ahead and move it up. I'd already introduced all you guys.
It's the presidential reality show. But when it became an Oprah production, it became slick. You don't have a president, you have an actor. They say that politics is show business for ugly people. You got it.
What am I going to tell the president when I tell him his teleprompter is broken? What will he do then?
It's Obama's role to front for the international banking syndicate and to take all the heat for their unpopular agenda. It's his job to convince the American people that the buck actually stops at the White House.
In Brzezinski's book, Between Two Ages, is that eventually we shall put presidents in who will have personality cults. We shall create massive personality cults for these people through the same techniques as Hollywood has used. Obama is that man today.
The globalists, who know that Obama is going to promote their plan, want to make him such a superhero that nobody will question what he's doing. They'll be so preoccupied with who he is, or where he is, or what he's saying, or what he's wearing, or something like that. The idea of making him into a celebrity is very valuable because that way people are less inclined to ask, what is he doing? So that's very useful to these people.
Similar plans of social control have been continuously carried out by operatives of the Ford Foundation, who Obama has worked for over the last 30 years. Many of the strategies used to control populations were originally developed by Edward Bernays, who coined the phrase public relations. Bernays said that if you manufacture an authoritative figure who repeats the same messages over and over, that this will appeal to the masses' subconscious desires.
Yes, we can.
The unwashed masses will helplessly follow the leader and go along with any message they spout.
Yes, we can. Yes, we can. We shall overcome. Yes, we can. We will respond with that timeless creed that sums up the spirit of a people. Yes, we can. Thank you.
Today, these exact techniques are being used with devastating effect against the general population. Obama is the latest version of 21st century mass mind control. The psych warfare engineers are counting on Obama to finish the plan they began decades ago. Beyond their plans to devastate the economy for global consolidation, a new international framework of draconian law is being constructed to establish a system of neo-feudalistic serfdom.
Remember, it was Bill Clinton who gave us NAFTA. And it was Al Gore, the hero of the environmental movement, who was the hatchet man for the Clinton administration to cram NAFTA down the throats of a reluctant Congress.
Now, this is a good deal for our country, Larry, and let me explain why.
Al Gore, who carried the ball for NAFTA and GATT, is now one of the top standard bearers for the elite's agenda.
This, I didn't interrupt you.
Okay, now, guys.
Then maybe it just...
Is this...
NAFTA. Why? Huge numbers of manufacturing jobs left Canada, came into the United States because of a 15% wage differential. We pay our workers less in Canada. Now, when you've got a 7-to-1 wage differential between the United States and Mexico, you will hear the giant sucking sound. No, there's a political lesson, there's a business lesson. Sorry.
He serves as the front man for the carbon tax cap and trade scheme, which will not only increase taxes on every American, but will also transfer our national sovereignty and rights to a tyrannical world government, all in the name of saving the earth.
Is the legislation that we are discussing here today, is that something that you are going to personally benefit from?
If you believe that the reason I have been working on this issue for 30 years is because of greed, you don't know me. I've been willing to put my money where my mouth is. Do you think there's something wrong with being active in business in this country?
I am simply asking for clarification.
I'm proud of
the
it.
relationship.
I'm proud of it.
My name's Dr. Tim Ball. I'm a climatologist. I have a PhD in climatology from the Queen Mary College, the University of London, England. And I've been studying climate both with my 9 years in the Canadian Air Force, where it was essential to flying, and then after that at the university. So it's essentially been the whole theme of my career. Initially we were called climate skeptics. I said, but all scientists are skeptics. If you're not a skeptic, you're not a scientist. And then when that didn't work, then they came out with the charge that we were climate change deniers. And I remember when I was first called a denier, and it was in the Times of London and England, and of course the word denier was clearly deliberately chosen because of the Holocaust connotations of that term. So it was not only a charge that you were ignoring the truth, but you were doing it in a very evil way. And of course I laugh about that now because my whole career has been anything but a climate change denier. I've spent my career trying to educate people to how much climate change is naturally. So I'm anything but a denier, but of course that is part of the politics.
Under the Nazis, there was something called race science. They had a lunatic theory of eugenics, the Aryan heritage, and all the rest of this. Absolute crackpot pseudoscience. There was no empirical measure or empirical test for the validity of those theories. They simply asserted them, and if you were a professor who stood up to them, then the Gestapo would come and take you away. We are perilously close to such a situation right now. Any academic, any other figure standing up to say the global warming theory of Al Gore is a piece of crackpot nonsense is in danger. You'd be fired from a government job, and in many universities, your job would be in danger.
And of course, it's also part of what's called ad hominem, that if you can't defeat the person's argument rationally, you start attacking the person. And we see that with these terms, and we see it with Al Gore calling them flat earthers.
Congressman, you began by denying that there is a consensus on the science. There is a consensus on the science.
Well, you mustn't have been listening to our testimony that we've had for the last few days with dozens of experts that have come in who have given completely different views.
Well,
I would encourage you to go back and look at the testimony this committee's heard.
There are people who still believe that the moon landing was staged on a movie lot in Arizona.
And neither of us are one of those, and I know you like giving those cute anecdotes. This is not a cutesy issue. We're talking about something that can export millions of jobs out of our economy, out of our country.
Richard Lindzen, an MIT professor of atmospheric physics, said it many years ago when he said the consensus was reached before the research had even begun. And then scientists like myself that stood up and said, hold on a minute, I got problems with this. Oh, paid by the oil companies, don't trust that guy.
What the international scientific community is saying is correct. There is no legitimate basis for denying it.
Now, you hear the consensus argument. Well, the majority of scientists. What they're always talking about is, and originally the IPCC was about 3,600 scientists, it's now down to 2,500. That's the people they're talking about. But when you look at it, most of them are bureaucrats. They're not scientists at all. And very, very few of them are actual climate experts.
Now, the consequences of that, and whether that's because of man-made CO2, I think are debatable.
If CO2 is not causing the climate change, what is? What are the major driving factors? And so they're essentially the ones that are left out by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's unbelievable to me that they can come out and ignore the sun. I mean, everybody knows the sun goes in, it gets cool. You notice that, right? You have an eclipse, the temperature drops, and the birds start to get excited and so on. And when you look at the seasonal changes with the sun, how you can suggest that the sun is not a factor is really quite remarkable.
Giving us false scientific information is not going to clean up our environment. Speaking with a lot of promises and innuendo is not going to help clean up our environment.
The globalists have co-opted the environmental movement. There are a lot of real environmental problems we face, like genetic engineering, where they're splicing plants, animals, insects, you name it. Toxic waste dumping in the ocean. No one wants to breathe bad air or drink toxic water. But the global carbon tax has nothing to do with that. It's a tax literally on breathing. Go out on the street or talk to your friends, your neighbors. Ask them, hey, should we ban dihydrogen monoxide? It's bad for the environment. The average person will sign your petition calling for the banning of water. That's right. Dihydrogen monoxide is water. It's the same thing with table salt, sodium chloride. And that's exactly what the establishment is doing with carbon dioxide. Ooh, dioxide. It has this scary sounding name. But the truth is, it's one of the 4 elements of life on this planet. Oxygen, carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight. And if the establishment can tax and list as a toxic waste one of those basic 4 building blocks of life, carbon dioxide, they can regulate and control every facet of our lives and shut down any businesses that aren't part of their New World Order.
The idea that carbon is a pollutant is essentially a way of saying that humanity is a disease or a cancer that ought to be wiped out. Genocide. People have argued in this environmental coterie around Obama, around Holdren, the theoretician of de-development, who is now the science advisor of the White House, really the anti-science advisor. They've argued that babies are carbon monsters, carbon machines, and that every time you breathe out carbon dioxide, you're part of the pollution of the planet. This is an absolutely anti-human doctrine.
They use the environmental movement to promote their real agenda, which is globalization and federalization and power.
The advisor to Gordon Brown wants to exterminate 1/2 of the population of the British Isles. Now that's something Hitler might have tried to do, or Stalin. They didn't succeed. Will Gordon Brown do it? You can read this in the statements of these lunatics, radical environmentalists, fanatical Malthusians, tree huggers, whatever you want to call them. This is an ideology of genocide which can be documented exhaustively, ad nauseum, out of their own statements.
When Gore said the science is settled, that raised red flags amongst the media, and then also amongst a lot of other people that sort of knew that that wasn't true, other scientists, and started to look at it. And of course, the more they looked at it, the more they realized, no, science is never settled.
What is coming down now is environmentalism, is nothing but phony science. Nothing but phony science. And if we really believe in the environment, if we really believe in freedom, if we really believe in truth, we need to get some straight answers.
Now, the Kyoto Agreement, of course, was reached in the city of Kyoto. And what was interesting was several things came out of that. But the first thing was that not all countries had to participate in Kyoto, but not all had to take action. Only the developed nations were required to reduce their level of CO2. The developing nations were excluded. Now, of course, at that time, China was, and in some ways you can argue it still is, a developing nation. So it wasn't required to meet any targets under Kyoto, nor was India. The U.S., of course, held out. And what's interesting is that the U.S. Senate voted 95-0 against the Kyoto Accord, even though Al Gore was the vice president at the time. And lucky for him, he didn't have to cast a deciding vote. But so it was 95-0 against it, because the U.S. Senate saw, no, this is a socialist distribution of wealth. This is going to cost jobs and economy, and so they scrapped it completely.
We're now told that you have to buy carbon offsets. In other words, if you have sinned by having a carbon footprint and by carbon emissions, you've got to buy a carbon offset, which is usually a scam. Somebody claims to have planted an acre of grass in the third world. It never happened. They take your money and laugh all the way to the bank. But they're telling you that in order to cleanse your guilt, you've got to buy a carbon offset.
Talk about carbon polluters. You talk about them. It's my understanding that back in 1997, when you were vice president, Enron's CEO, Ken Lay, was involved in discussions with you at the White House about helping develop this type of policy, this trading scheme. And is that accurate? Is it inaccurate? It's been reported.
I don't know, but I met with Ken Lay, as lots of people did, before anybody knew that he was a crook.
Right, and clearly you can see why so many of us are concerned about this type of cap-and-trade energy tax that would be literally turning over this country's energy economy.
I didn't know him well enough to call him Kenny Boy.
Well, but you knew him well enough to help devise this trading scheme, and obviously we know what Enron and these big guys on Wall Street like Goldman Sachs, and I know you've got interest with Goldman Sachs.
No.
Well, that's been reported. Is that not accurate?
No, I wish I did.
With executives you're partnered in companies with executives from Goldman Sachs. Well, if you're not.
Al Gore has got to be the greatest con artist in modern history. This guy claims he invented the internet, even though it's on record he's a liar, and he got away with it. He was the pitchman that successfully sold, as vice president, NAFTA and GATT, that's lowered the standard of living in the United States and Mexico and almost completely deindustrialized our country. Now he's saying you should pay him and his private company, set up by Enron, a carbon tax on breathing. Look, if you want to buy Al Gore's propaganda, go ahead. But before you do that, you should at least look into the claims he's making.
There was a meeting in the White House in 1998 between Al Gore and Bill Clinton, Ken Lay, and Lord Brown. Okay, well, who were these people? Well, we know the president, the vice president. Ken Lay, of course, was the president of Enron. And Enron was a major, major player in the carbon credit, carbon trading. And in fact, stood to make an enormous amount of money out of it. And so it was part of I think, part of the collapse of Enron. And Lord Brown, of course, was the head of the largest oil company in the world. And they were looking to buy into this, as is happening now, where the energy companies are becoming the big promoters of, oh, we got to go green, we got to go to alternate energies, and all of this this stuff. They saw a business opportunity and leapt onto it, and one that would make them look green again.
When it came time for the 1,200-plus page greenhouse gas emission and carbon legislation to be voted on, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, would not let the Republicans, or even members of her own party, see the bill until minutes before the vote. Republican Minority Leader John Boehner engaged in a rare House filibuster and read shocking section after shocking section from the legislation.
I really hate to do this, but when you file a 300-page amendment at 3:09 a.m., the American people have a right to know what's in this bill and have a right to know what we're voting on. Page 48. Each building code enforcement department receiving a grant under subsection A shall impanel a code administration and enforcement team consisting of at least one full-time building code enforcement officer, a city planner, and a health planner or similar officer.
I can take you to Chickasaw, Mercer County in my district. They don't have one full-time person that works for the village, all right? Not one. Look at the mandate on every city, village in America right here in this bill. So that we're not only going to tell you what the codes are going to be, but we're going to tell you how many people you need to hire to enforce this. Page 41, determine any geographic area within the contiguous United States that lacks a federal power marketing agency. Because, you know, we can't move power around the country without a federal power marketing agency. We do it today, but now we have to have a new government agency to do this. All California housing standards are now going to be imposed on every American community. You don't have the right to have your own building standards in your community or in your state. Hell no, the federal government's going to tell you what they are.
It quickly became clear why Pelosi and the Democratic leadership were desperate to keep the contents of the bill secret before the vote.
Now, because of this underlying bill, the federal government will virtually have control over every aspect of lives for the American people. It is time to stand up and say, we get to choose. We choose liberty or we choose tyranny. It's one of the two. The underlying bill represents the tyranny and the intervention of the federal government. It's our choice. What will we choose today? Will we choose liberty or will we choose tyranny?
And I know that we'll be facing the single moms that heard from last summer. They can't afford the gasoline bill. They can't afford the propane. You didn't do a great thing. You hurt some really decent families struggling, trying to make it, and this is going to be their death knell. It breaks my heart. I yield back.
It is, of course, a carbon tax on economic activity, farming, manufacturing, real production here inside the United States. It would tend to shut down even those miserable remains of an industrial economy that we still have after the collapse of the Detroit automakers and their related subcontractors and so forth.
Every home and business in the United States would be federally regulated and controlled. Mandatory home inspections will be carried out by federal inspectors, and it's all at the expense of the homeowner.
In New York, they're called the environmental police.
On this day, a surprise visit to a market in Brooklyn's Chinatown.
And every day you're not in compliance, you face huge fines.
Go to page 235. The Secretary may set and collect reasonable inspection fees to cover the cost of inspections required. So number one, they can come in, the federal government can come in and inspect your house and send you the bill. And if they find that you're out of compliance with this new federal code, the Secretary shall assess a civil penalty for violations of this section. And then further, going to page 236, each day of unlawful occupancy shall be considered a separate violation. We're setting up a global warming Gestapo that can literally come in, and now this new term, unlawful occupancy. So now living in your home is considered unlawful under this bill. This is ludicrous.
Worst of all, carbon czars in more than 35 federal agencies are given unlimited dictatorial power to tax all forms of carbon and carbon emissions. The Commissar Green Police openly brag that they will have the power to selectively enforce the new edicts on a case-by-case basis.
It's funny because when I tell people what I do for a living, the first response usually is, "You're with the environmental police?" There is no environment in New York City.
With this new power, the Green Mafia can take over the entire economy through selective enforcement.
We know, Madam Speaker, that this national energy tax will cost the American people $2 trillion. We know that. We know this will result in a loss of 2.5 million jobs every year for the American people. We know that. We know this will result in a reduced standard of living for Americans. We know that. What is the point and what's the benefit?
The same central banks that have stolen more than $50 trillion from national treasuries across the planet are now creating a new derivatives fraud through the cap-and-trade carbon tax system that dwarfs their previous Ponzi schemes.
We've just watched a financial meltdown in this country, the likes of which hasn't been seen in some time. Now, if people like credit default swaps, they're really going to like the carbon swaps that are going to occur and the carbon future swaps. We spent a full day in this committee last summer talking about the manipulation of the energy futures market in oil. We're going to create, I fear, another such system that people who have an inclination to react dishonestly to systems are going to actually have a new opportunity. Is that not a problem?
A select group of central banks are lobbying for the same legislation to be passed worldwide. Once the so-called green economy laws are in place, only global megacorporations and their subsidiaries will be allowed to do business. Van Jones, Barack Obama's first green job czar, has stated repeatedly on the record that the new green economy is only a cover for a complete revolution against capitalism and the total redistribution of wealth. But what Van Jones doesn't tell his sad followers is that the elite are bragging that the modern green movement was designed from its creation to destroy the middle class and transfer all wealth into the hands of a super elite. They're not doing this to uplift the poor. No, the goal is to enslave the planet and usher in a new dark age. Every nation on Earth is in the process of, or has already passed, its own set of carbon tax laws and regulations. If their plan is successful, every nation on Earth will not only pay tribute to the powerful world government, but every facet of human life will be regulated by the technocratic global planners. Under the carbon tax scheme, China, India, Mexico, and over 150 other nations are exempt from the global tax system. You see, the bankers already own and control the third world. Their final target is the middle class of the West. Once they've dismantled the economies of the United States, Europe, and Japan, they believe no one can stand in their way. In short, the New World Order is a global corporate takeover. In their global corporate state, there is no room for individuality, sovereignty, or independence. As their program begins to face more and more opposition, lawmakers and supporters of the man-made global warming hypothesis want laws to be passed, making it illegal to question their theories. Recently, the head of Greenpeace was forced to admit that the Arctic and Antarctic ice caps grow in the winter and shrink in the summer, and that this is all part of a natural process driven by the tilt of the Earth and the Sun.
The cosmic radiation coming from space, the amount reaching the Earth is affected by the strength of the Sun's magnetic field. So the magnetic field of the Sun is almost like a gateway controlling the cosmic radiation reaching the Earth. The magnetic strength of the Sun is also related to the number of sunspots. So they are directly related to changes within the inner structure of the Sun. The amount of cosmic radiation reaching the lower atmosphere creates more cloud, right? And cloud forms, you need to have what are called condensation nuclei. That is, little particles around which water can change from water vapor or gas into water droplets, minute particles that are visible in the form of clouds. We've known for a long time that there was more cloud than the amount of particles in the atmosphere, because we assumed it was clay particles and salt particles that were creating this condensation process, but there was this gap. We now realize, of course, it's the cosmic radiation that's doing it. So what the cosmic radiation is doing, controlled by the magnetic field of the Sun, is it's like putting up a screen in the greenhouse and blocking out the sunlight, and of course that then affects the temperature of the Earth. That's why there's a relationship between the sunspots and the temperature on the Earth. So we now know the mechanism, but they completely ignore that.
More than 31,000 scientists from across the United States, including more than 9,000 PhDs from the fields of climatology, atmospheric science, earth science, and hydrology, signed a petition rejecting man-made global warming as a scientific fraud. This shattered the hoax of the so-called consensus that the mainstream media had been pushing for years, that every scientist on Earth believed that man-made global warming was a fact. If the people are able to block their carbon tax takeover, the elite's agenda to establish a planetary world government will collapse. To force their unpopular agenda upon the planet, the controllers are racing to complete the construction of their police state control grid. Borrowing from tactics used in the past by communist, fascist, and other totalitarian regimes, every form of classical textbook tyranny is now being implemented in the West. In the United States, the central government is federalizing local police.
State and local officers are in a great position to collect important information on terrorists and their allies. And the Terrorist Screening Center stands ready to help you.
This video, produced by Homeland Security, is required viewing for all departments in the U.S.
And with the teamwork of local, state, and federal law enforcement, we have an excellent opportunity to see the picture and solve the puzzle before these terrorists can strike again.
State, county, and city police now take their marching orders directly from DHS and FEMA. The videos and training manuals turn peace officers, once guardians of the Republic, into secret police.
See way down there? There's a woman taking photos of the dam. Someone called 911 and reported a suspicious person. As you guessed, she's going to be a Category 3 hit. And since it's very important that we don't let her know that we know, both the dispatcher and the officer need to make sure she doesn't hear the radio traffic.
Stand by. If I could ask you to wait right here, please.
Sure.
Everyday items and activities are listed as proof that you are sympathizing with shadowy boogeymen of terror.
Of course, he's going to keep his eyes open for anything interesting or unusual in the car. That would include cameras, binoculars, video equipment, GPS, maybe things like sleeping bags that suggest they're living out of the car.
From their inception, Homeland Security and Northcom were set up to dominate the people and the states, not to fight the CIA-created Al-Qaeda. Patriotic members of the military and law enforcement, at great risk to their lives and careers, have sent this filmmaker federally and internationally produced law enforcement manuals, textbooks, documents, and videos. The MIAC report, distributed to Missouri law enforcement, lists gun owners, libertarians, constitutionalists as potential terrorists. The federally written document went on to list Ron Paul, Bob Barr, and American flag bumper stickers as dangerous paraphernalia linked to white supremacists. Even before 9/11, FEMA was quietly indoctrinating local police to have a hatred of the Founding Fathers and everything our constitutional republic stands for.
Who was the first terrorist organization in the United States? Who? Founding Fathers. Founding Fathers. You mean Thomas Jefferson? Oh, yeah. You mean George Washington? Oh, yeah. Paul Revere? Yeah. These guys right here, let me ask you something. Did they try to scare people? Oh, yeah. They tried to intimidate the British. Did they use acts of violence? Your founding fathers, my founding fathers, were involved in acts of terrorism against British officials because they systematically had British officials assassinated.
In the old Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, and Maoist China, the police's main job was not fighting crime. In totalitarian forms of government, the police are political enforcers, or commissars as they were known in Russia. It's their job to spy on the public and to intimidate the exercise of free speech. Once a climate of fear has been achieved, the public begins to self-censor, to shut down. Once the people have been intimidated to withdraw from the field of intellectual battle, the tyrants have a free hand to expand their oppression and looting of the helpless serfs. The average man and woman is in a trance. They get home from work, they don't even talk to their children. They turn the television on, and they let those corporate messages set the agenda in their lives. If we want a revolution against these social engineers and the scientific dictatorship, we have to start getting back to basics. Having barbecues, knowing our neighbors, loving our husbands and wives, spending time with our children, and getting back to real human culture. This false corporate culture has been superimposed over our daily lives. The public is literally under a trance. We have to somehow reach out to them and break them out of this trance. And as the globalists destroy our standard of living and bring in their police state, a lot of people are beginning to wake up and realize that what they've been told all their lives was a lie. But it's essential that we, the people, are there to reach out to our fellow Americans and our fellow human beings and show them the truth. But the scientific dictatorship needs more than just a secret police network to carry out their plan. Citizen spies at every level of society have been recruited to keep their eyes and ears focused on everything their neighbors and co-workers are doing and saying. More than 50,000 private sector executives have been recruited by FEMA to secretly serve as deputy FBI informants under the InfraGard program. Now there are more than 75,000 preachers serving FEMA in the clergy response teams. Internal FEMA documents reveal that the majority of America's pastors now serve as agents of the shadow government. They are even instructed on how and what to preach.
And as KSLA News 12 Jeff Farrell discovered, the clergy would help the government with potentially their biggest problem, us.
From my cold, dead hands.
Charlton Heston's famous declaration captures a truly American value, the overarching desire to protect our freedoms. But gun confiscation is exactly what happened during the state of emergency following Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. U.S. troops also arrived, something far easier to do even now thanks to last year's elimination of the 1878 Posse Comitatus Act. That forbid U.S. troops from policing on American soil. If martial law were enacted here at home, public fears and quelling dissent would be critical. And that's exactly what the clergy response team, as it's called, helped accomplish in New Orleans.
Jeff, the primary thing that we say to anybody is let's cooperate and get this thing over with, and then we'll settle the differences once the crisis is over.
Such clergy response teams would walk a tightrope between the needs of the government versus the wishes of the public.
In a lot of cases, these clergy would already be known in the neighborhoods in which they're helping to defuse that situation.
For the clergy, one of the biggest tools that they will have in helping calm the public down or obey the law is the Bible itself, specifically Romans 13.
Because the government is established by the Lord, you know, and that's what we believe in the Christian faith. That's what's stated in the Scripture.
They prepare their flocks like sheep to the slaughter for gun confiscation, forced inoculation, and they tell them that it is a blessing to have their families broken up and put into FEMA camps.
Irland, Frankreich, Portugal, Spanien, die Schweiz, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, Polen, Ungarn, Romania.
Adolf Hitler bragged that his most powerful domestic tool, used by the Nazis to control the people, was the servile clergy. And his favorite Bible verse was Romans 13. Render unto Caesar.
Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
The scam was launched as a simple bait and switch. The government recruited the public by telling them that they were needed in the fight against Al-Qaeda. But from day one, over 90% of their training and operations focus on demonizing, surveilling, and harassing anyone who stands against their takeover.
The Department of Homeland Security calling on firefighters to take on a new role in the war on terror. The idea to be the eyes for the U.S. government when they're inside a home. Now, unlike police officers, firefighters don't need a warrant to go into private houses. And critics say that's where things get sticky.
Cable company repairmen, truck drivers, maid services, and hundreds of other professions that go inside homes and businesses without warrants are now on the government's payroll as citizen snitch spies. But Big Brother doesn't stop there. Children are being indoctrinated inside the public schools nationwide to spy on their parents.
You can give information without having to give your name. You guys can get paid for good tips up to $200.
The New York Times praised public school programs in the United States and England that are training children to report their parents for eco-crimes, like taking a hot bath or letting the water run while you brush your teeth. All of that violates their carbon footprint credit allotment.
Check it out, check it out. And that's where we come in. We're the carbon cops and we're on the lookout for energy wasters.
Our job is to get all Australian households to cut their carbon emissions. So Carbon Cops is a program that looked at energy use in a domestic sense. We went into people's houses and got them to reduce their energy use by 50%.
Sadly, the Boy Scouts of America have now contracted with the Department of Homeland Security and are now training more than 20,000 Boy Scouts in anti-terror urban warfare mount training. The federal grants are very specific. The Scouts are trained to carry out seek and destroy missions against disgruntled veterans of the U.S. Armed Forces.
Good evening, everyone. Homeland Security is enlisting some unlikely new recruits to fight terrorism and help with other emergencies. The Girl Scouts. Girl Scouts across the country and here in East Tennessee are now taking part. 9-year-old Elise Murphy has already earned a lot of Girl Scout patches.
And now, every member of the 3.4 million Girl Scouts of America is now being trained by the Federal Emergency Management Agency to aid and support Homeland Security in disaster and anti-terror operations.
One of the things that if you talk to our generals, they are desperate for is a civilian counterpart to our military forces.
Everybody somewhere between the ages of 18 and 25 will serve 3 months of basic training and understanding in a kind of civil defense.
So is this compulsory then?
Well, you have to, in a sense, it's a required of everybody, 18 to 25, 3 months, and at some point at that point you do it.
Creating citizen armies in one way is, you know, it's disgusting, because what you do is you get young kids and you can mold their minds easily. And we saw them chanting and crying, and they'll follow any leader, whether it's in a black shirt, a brown shirt, a red shirt, whatever the shirt might be.
Another branch of Homeland Security, the Corporation for National and Community Service, is setting up literally hundreds of other private uniformed youth groups. The White House has introduced legislation to establish forced national service for all Americans between the ages of 16 and 64. In 2008, the North American Military Governorship, known as NORTHCOM, announced that they had deployed 4,000 regular Army troops inside the United States to deal with civil unrest because they knew that their offshore masters were about to rob the United States blind. In 2009, the Pentagon requested funding from Congress to deploy 379,000 military personnel in thousands of communities across the United States. And now, legislation has been introduced in Congress to expand a system of FEMA concentration camps across the United States under the National Emergency Centers Act, H.R. 645. The Republic is hanging by a thread. The last vestiges of our free system of government are being swept away.
You know, you got time to watch baseball, you got time to watch football, you got time to entertain yourself, but I think a knowledgeable public we're losing, and we've got to get people back on track to paying attention, because if you don't pay attention to your government and what they're doing, you're going to pay some dire consequences for it.
Unless we become active and become influential in the power centers of society, there's nothing we can do about it. Just knowing about it is not enough. And as long as we are given at election time an option between the Republican candidate or the Democrat candidate, both of whom have been selected by members of the Council on Foreign Relations and both of whom have the same general policies, that's not going to change anything either. So the real issue is, so what? And the answer is we've got to recapture control of the power centers of society.
The people have a decision to make. Our nation has been seized in the jaws of a global corporate takeover. The Republic is passing into history. We're losing our freedoms. And it's up to every man, woman, and child in the United States to decide whether we're going to be fooled by the slick propaganda of the social engineers or whether we're going to restore the Republic.
The values expressed by our founding fathers and the Declaration of Independence and other documents are very important to these times, and it's now our chance to manifest those documents.
Now is the time for all good men to come to the aid of their country, because the country is being stolen from us in broad daylight. Not only stolen metaphorically, but financially as well. The numbers don't lie.
The American people, having been educated as to the truth, then have to rise up and demand and get a government that starts serving them. We need a change, and it isn't going to come from Democrats and Republicans. It has to come from the American people.
Dissension is the greatest form of patriotism, and I believe that. Because if you don't hold your elected officials' feet to the fire and pay attention, you are going to get bad government. So it's imperative for all of us. It's our job as citizens of this great country to pay attention.
This is our last chance to not relive history. Hundreds of nations have fallen to tyranny in the last century alone. America is a prize coveted by the despotic megacorporations that now dominate our planet. If their world government is truly to rise, freedom and the republic for which it stands must fall. Now is the time for all good men and women to come to the aid of their country. One of the greatest events in history is taking place before our very eyes. For many generations into the future, our progeny will look back on this time as either a place where humanity rose to the challenge and made a stand against the forces of darkness, or as a time when the planet fell into the grip of a merciless high-tech tyranny. In Part 2 of Fall of the Republic, you will learn the elite's master plan for humanity. But more importantly, you will learn how to stop that plan, reverse the criminal tide, and reignite the flame of liberty on the long march to man's ultimate destiny.